Hey now people, today we are taking a look at Lewis and Clark, The Expedition. Now this was a game that was pretty big at Essen last year. It actually made my list of the top 10 anticipated games from Essen because I'd heard some pretty good buzz about it. Not just the theme, which is basically, it's Lewis and Clark. It's right there in the title. You're actually taking control of these adventures or adventuring parties, not necessarily Lewis and Clark themselves, and you're recruiting people to help you. You're recruiting Native Americans, and it's basically a race. You're trying to be the first one to get to the end of the river, and there's no points in this game. Whoever can cross that end point and make camp is the winner. And so that theme really interested me, and I like the artwork. I liked the little bit of deck building that I had heard that there was in it, and it just had some good buzz about it, and it's finally hitting North American shelves. I thought I would give it a try. It's a bit of a risk for me because I'm not that into Euro games. And this is essentially a Euro game, despite what I would argue could be a stronger theme than usual for a Euro game. But did I end up liking it? Well, let me give you a brief, very brief overview of the game. Then we'll come back and I'll tell you what I think. Folks, this is just going to be a very brief overview of Lewis and Clark because even though the game is actually relatively simple, it's not too complex, there are a lot of little details to it, especially with the different cards that you can purchase and put into your deck, or I should say hand. So I'm not going to cover all of that, but I'm just going to give you a very brief glossing overview to see if it's something that might tickle your fancy, so to speak. So at the beginning of the game, each player is going to get a different player board with their color and a different little miniature and a camp token of their color, and they're also going to get a deck of, or hand of 6 cards. Now, all of these cards are the same and have the same effects, but it's to the game's credit that all of the artwork and the names of the cards are actually different. But basically, this is a card-driven game. The theme of the game is the expedition of Lewis and Clark, and it's a race. You're trying to get from St. Louis all the way to Fort Clatsop and be the first one to do it. The first person to cross the finish line to Fort Clatsop and then set up camp is going to be the winner of the game. The game will immediately end. Now, on your turn, you have one mandatory action that you have to take. The first mandatory action can be the using one of the different Indian spaces out here. Now, this represents all the Indians or Native Americans who you can either recruit to help your tribe or use their sort of tribal ability spaces. And just as a side note, one of my dogs already destroyed one of the Indians' miniatures, meeples, so you know that this game has been christened into part of my collection. That's just the little ritualistic sacrifice that has to happen to all of my games. But I digress. Now, you'll have these Indian tokens, which, and basically this is where a little bit of worker placement comes into the game. If you have you'll have a spot on your board where you can place Indians. There's one spot where you can place them where it will have no penalty on you, or there's another spot where you can have as many Indians as you want. However, if you have even one there at a certain point in the game, which I'll get to in a moment, then it's going to cost you time on the river. But again, we'll get back to that. But one of the actions you can do is you can take one of your Indians from your stock and put them out on a certain space on the board, like worker placement. Wherever you're going to put them, you're going to get the ability corresponding to that, and then you actually lose this Indian. They go back into what I believe is called, I don't even want to mispronounce it. So it goes back into the central area here, and it's lost to you, essentially. But let's just go through a few of these different spaces. So one of the spaces is going to give you food and pelts. Now, that's what all these little tokens are off to the side. They all correspond. So, for instance, the pinkish, purplish ones are food. These are pelts. You have equipment, and you have wood. You also have horses and boats. Yes, use your imagination. But that's basically what all of those different things do. So that will give you those resources. Here you get equipment and wood. Here you'll get either 2 pelts or 2 wood. Here you can trade in 2 wood in order to get 1 boat, which actually makes some thematic sense. Here you can get rid of any 3 different resources in order to get a horse. Here you can actually get rid of a food in order to use someone else's card that they've already played, and we haven't really gotten to the cards yet. But and down here you can actually get rid of 3 wood in order to take one of these 2 different boats. Now, there's actually a total of 4 boats because there's 2 different sides on each of these, but basically these boats, you only have a certain amount of resources that you can hold on your boats. This starting board actually represents all the boats that you have in your party. Now, if you only have stuff on your first boat and you see there's 3 spots there, then there's no penalty. But as you get more and more and more equipment, it's going to go into these other spots, which are going to cost you time as you travel down the river. And of course, here's the Indian spots here. But if you take these boats, that will help you out a little bit. So this boat here is strictly for it's a canoe for having an Indian go on, and it won't cost you any time whatsoever. However, you could choose to use this other spot, which gives you 3 more Indian spaces, but it would only cost you 1 time. This is still a better exchange than the big wide open space here, because here you're going to lose time for every Indian that you have. So that's one option you can do. The other one is to take one of these other boats, which is strictly for goods. You can take this side, which is going to let you hold 2 of any good with no time cost whatsoever, or you can go to this side, which gives you 5 more spaces, but if you have even 1 there, it's going to cost you a time. So you kind of have to make that decision when you go there, but having more boats is always a good thing. And there's another space here that's going to let you call up to 3 cards from your deck. So there's just a wide variety of options you have out there. And finally, there's a space here that if you take it, any Indians that have gone back into the center area, you can actually choose to take as many or as few of them as you want, and then the rest just sort of disperse. That's just sort of your call. But remember, having Indians is always a good thing, and I haven't even told you all that they can do yet, but they will weigh down your boats, costing you time on the race. Now let's get to the cards, which are sort of the main focal point of the game. This is sort of a deck building game, but better to consider it a hand building and hand management game. I mentioned that everyone starts with the same, essentially 6 cards, just with different art. And they're all going to do different things. Now, one of the options you can do, instead of taking that Indian action, is to actually play one of your cards. I say one of your cards, but really you have to play a set of cards. Now, the cards are all double-sided. On the front, or if you want to call it the front of the card, it's going to tell you what you have to, what action you get for playing this card. So, for instance, Seaman here, which is a dog, apparently, by playing this card, you're going to get food. Now, you can't just play a card. You have to fuel the card. On the other side of these cards is basically using this as a fuel. So, if you play this card, you're going to play it, like, let's just take another one of my cards. If I wanted to play the Seaman card, I have to play another card with it to fuel it. Every card has at least one of these filled in Indian symbols, because that's the minimum amount of Indians you need in order to make a card happen, to actually use the card. So if I played this card, I would get at least 1 food. Now the amount of food or any kind of resource that you get is depending on the number of badges that match up to it. See how there's a yellow pelt badge here? Well, that's not going to have any effect on Seaman's card, because this is only for food, which are the purple badges. So I would play this card and I would get at least 1 food, and you're always multiplying by the number of Indians that you have. So 1 times 1 badge is 1 food. But this counts the badges of every player at the table who's in the game. So if other players have badges of the same color, you're going to get an extra food for each of those. And of course, you're limited by how much food you can actually carry or want to carry. Although if you're gaining food, you have to take it. You don't have a choice to discard it. You can only willingly discard any resource if you're full, and you have to make the choice of what goes and what stays. But let's say, for instance, you're playing this card and you want even more food. Maybe no one else has played badges and you only have your 1 measly badge to worry about. If you have Indians on your boat, you can actually place the Indians on this card up to the 3 spaces, and that increases your multiplier. So if you have 3 Indians on this card, it multiplies by the total number of badges that you have, not just this badge, every badge on the table. If there's a total of 4 badges you're counting and you have a 3 multiplier, you get 12 food. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, just to backtrack just a bit, some of the other symbols on this card, down here is just a player symbol indicating what you're actually, which player that it's actually for. The other symbols here, this one up in the top signifies time again, just like on the player board. In this case, if you have any of these, once you've played all of your cards out on the table, you have the choice, the optional choice, during your turn to scoop all the cards back up. You've played all your cards, you need more cards, you take them all back up. However, and by doing so, that's called making camp. When you make camp, this will move. So if you've moved further up the river by playing certain cards, for instance, in your starting hand, you have this card, which is going to, if you play it, you can sacrifice a food to go 2 up the river, a boat to go 4 up the river, or a horse to go 2 up the mountain. So that's how you're going to win the game, is you're going to proceed up the track. Now, as you do that, however, you run the risk of being kicked back. Part of that is from being a bit weighed down with either too many Indians or too many resources. But also, if you choose to camp and get all the cards back and also move your token up, you also get kicked back for every card that you have left in your hand, in addition to how much you're weighed down. So having more cards in your hand when you choose to take them all back and set camp can be a bad thing. You're incentivized to try to get rid of as many cards as you can before you decide to make camp. Now the good news here is that after you get done moving and you settle how much you have to get kicked back and then finally make camp, when you move your camp token up there on the board, you can never get pushed down below that point. So it's sort of a little bit of a push your luck here, but basically you want to try to get as far up the track as you can and camp there so you don't get pushed back as far if you have to take penalties. Now the other symbol on this card is a little equipment symbol, and that's going to have to do with purchasing cards in the game. I did mention there's a little bit of deck and hand building here. You always have 5 cards available to choose from. They'll come off from this main center deck, and these are all different cards, and there's almost every single one of all of them really are different. I cannot go through every single one, but I'll tell you what a few of them do. But basically what's going to happen is in order to actually buy these cards, it's an optional thing you can always do at the end of your turn. In order to buy the cards, you have to have 2 different resources. First is pelts. It's hard to see, I know, with my camera, but there's these little pelt icons here, and they get cheaper as they go along towards the left. The ones in the bottom are the most likely to get destroyed by other effects, but that makes them cheaper as well. So 1 pelt, 2 pelt, 3 pelts, 4 pelts, and 5 pelts. Now the other symbol here is an equipment symbol, and this matches up to the number on the top of the card, which I did not explain yet. So there'll be an equipment symbol there. That means that's how many equipment you also have to spend in order to buy that. So to buy the card in the first slot all the way over to the left, you're going to have 1 pelt and 1 equipment. 2 pelts, 1 equipment, because he's only worth 1. But down here we have a number 3 there, so you need 4 pelts and 3 equipment. But that's where we get back to the back of the card with that equipment symbol. And you can, what that basically means, you can get rid of just 1 card from your hand. You're limited to 1. And when I say get rid of, I mean trash it, permanently remove it from your hand and from the game in order to get a discount of whatever, actually, I'm sorry, it's however many Indians are on the card. So if it only has 1 Indian and you choose to sack it in order to get a discount, you'll just get 1 off the cost of the equipment. But if it happens to have 2 or 3, you'll get that much, and it'll have that consequent amount of symbols as well. So it's something to keep in mind. And basically by buying these, you're making your deck better and stronger and having better abilities. And there's a lot of iconography in this game. I'm probably not going to be able to tell you exactly what each of these does, but I'll give it my best shot. In fact, let's pick a simpler one. So if you play, and of course, Fuel, the big horse card, and all of these are different. All of them are different characters and names. They also have badges as well. You can choose to get rid of 2 Indians, put them back in the I believe that's called a wampum. I don't want to say that out of school because it doesn't sound quite right. I don't want to offend anybody, but you'll put those 2 back on the board and you'll be able to get a horse. That's what he does. This one here, you can use him to use a boat to go 5 spaces up the river. So that's better than the normal card that you have in your hand that only moves you up 4. This one lets you put an Indian back on the board and spend resources to move up the river, I believe, something like that. This one gives you, for 2 equipment, you get a horse. A few of the other ones, just randomly off top of the deck. If you give up a food, and I don't know what those do. There's a lot of icons in this game that you're constantly referring to the rule book in this game, I will say that. Now, he, I believe, is interesting because he basically stays in play, and this is an interesting one to pick, actually, because he stays in play after you play him. Well, they all stay in play, but until you scoop your hand, as long as he is in play, when you move up the river, you always hop over people if you pass over them. But he actually does not count the spaces that other players are occupying, which means you're actually getting extra movement so long as you're hopping over people. So that's kind of cool. Here's a 3 card, which can be very good because obviously it gives you more power to do stuff. Oh, I actually know this one because I used her in the game. If you spend an Indian and a resource of any kind, you get to go over 2 mountains. Because that's the other thing. On the board, I know it's hard to see, but you have river spaces, mountain spaces, river spaces, mountain spaces. You constantly have to traverse 2 types of terrain in order to get to the end. So you have to carefully plan how you're going to use both river movement and mountain movement. And I'm sure there's some other things I didn't cover. There's actually some other little tokens that come with the game, which after your first play, you can actually permanently modify the board during your playthroughs in order to give you more of a variety and challenge. And there's also tokens that come with it that are used expressly for solo play. And basically these go out on the board and they count as extra badges for when you use resource cards. And in that solo variant, you're actually playing against sort of a phantom dummy player who's constantly moving up the river. But nevertheless, for the most part, that is Lewis and Clark, the Expedition. Lewis and Clark is what I would like to call probably one of my most overused phrases, and that's brain burning or brain burning. Now, don't get me wrong, if you've heard that phrase before, this is not a overly complex game. It's actually relatively simple. I think trying to figure out some of the little mechanics about fueling the cards with other cards and powering them up, just to use some probably improper terminology, powering up the cards with more Indians, things like that. That can be a little weird at first, trying to figure out how that all works, but really when you get down to it, once you're like at the midpoint of the game, you're like, oh, okay. And it's actually very simple. You know, there's a lot of different cards in the game, and that can be a little overwhelming because, you know, especially in your first playthrough, because of the iconography where they're trying to be language independent, you're constantly looking through that book, so that can be overwhelming knowing all the different choices that you have, but it's still a very simple game as far as learning the rules and how you play. The reason I say it's brain burning is, well, just because of that, because of the overwhelming amount of options that you have. All the different cards that you have the possibility of recruiting to your deck, and all the, you know, you look out at that wide area of the Native American encampments, and, you know, there's all these different options of where you could use if you have the Indians available. It can just be a lot to take in. You have so many, or at least it feels like you have so many things you can do on your turn. And not just that, how you use the cards in your hand. So is it worth it to use this card as a fuel for another card, knowing that you may have wanted to use the ability on that card before you scoop up your cards? And when do you scoop up your cards? I mean, the longer you leave them out there, the more likely it is that the other players are going to be able to use those badges on there in order to power their cards more. And the less likely that you're going to, you know, you also cannot take back the cards and use again that you really want to use. But if you scoop too early and you're stuck with cards in your hands, that means it's further back that you're going to have to go, which makes it more dangerous. I mean, that is why I call it brain burning, because there's a lot of options out available to you. I would make the argument, and the number one thing that people disagree with me on in all of my videos when people make comments are the length that I claim that the game is. I've said that other games are, wow, this game is like 3 hours long. People are like, 3 hours? What are you doing? This game never took me longer than 15 minutes. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but that's basically what I get from people. Now, the box for Lewis and Clark says 30 minutes. I call ridiculousness on that. Maybe if you're playing with the solo game, which I did try, and it's very interesting, but this is not a game that was meant to be played solo. So let's just gloss over that. But if you're playing with more than 2 people, there is no way that's going to happen. Because, especially, unless you've been playing the game and it's like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. Because there's just so many options, all the different cards that you have access to, and the different things that you can do. The game really lends itself, I believe, to analysis paralysis. And I like to think that I'm not like that in most games, but I think I was in this game because there's just the, you know, just what should I do, how should I manipulate things. Now, it probably sounds like I'm coming down really hard on this game because of that, but I'm really not. I like this game. I think it needs more time to grow on me. I don't love it yet, and maybe I won't love it, but, you know, in other words, as far as my final opinion on it, the jury is still out. I've played it 3 times, twice with people, once by myself, and I need more time with it because it's just, there's a lot here that I love. I love the design of it. I love the theme of it. And that's a hard thing for me to say for a Euro game. I don't always say that. And I think this is a Euro game. There's not as much deck building as I would like. I think that, well, I'm not going to say that I was sold a false bill of goods or anything like that, but I expected there to be more. But really, the deck building in this it's so different than other deck building games that I've played. Because it's not that you're making a deck, you're making a hand. It's a hand building game. I've heard people refer to this game as that. It might even be on the box, but you know, and that's a neat thing. I'm not really saying that's a bad thing because but again, it adds that sort of brain burning element of it. But I like that. Now, the fact that there's no scoring in that, I do like that. But here's what I will say. Despite the fact, you know, I've played other Euro games where it is clearly obvious at a certain point that you're not going to win. Someone gets such an overwhelming advantage in points, or their engine is, you know, ramping up so heavily that you kind of know that you're out. I would say that there's a couple Stefan Feld games like that. But with this game, I think there is that issue as well, even despite the fact that there are no points, because if you're doing poorly, then it's constantly a game of catch up. And you might feel very excited when you finally catch up to someone, but just catching up to someone is not enough. You have to have a very, very strong turn in order to surpass that person. Catching up to them is great, and you're like, yay! But really, that person is already 1, 2, or 3 turns ahead of you because they were that far ahead. By the time you catch up, in other words, that person is ramping up to just leave you behind in the dust again, or in the water. So that, I think, can be an issue. Now, I did say that the game was long, longer than the box says, but it's not that long. This isn't like an overwhelmingly long game. I would say that 60 to 90 minutes is a little more reasonable once you're familiar with the game. And in that case, knowing that you're going to lose, not so bad, because I think that even when people can be prone to AP, the turns still move fairly quickly. And some turns go by very quickly because sometimes all people can do on their turn is scoop or take a, just do an Indian action and not buy a card and boom, they're done. Other turns, someone may be able to do everything. They want to play cards. They have to decide how they're going to use their Indians to fuel those cards. They're, can't do everything, but they're just making the most of their turn. They're deciding what card to buy. Things like that. So those turns are going to go slower, but for the most part, the game feels very fast-paced, even if it does take, in my opinion, 60 to 90 minutes on average. But, I'm sure people will disagree with me on that. So overall, I like it. I like the components. I like the art. I like the theme. And I like the gameplay itself. It's just, to me, it feels crunchy. I'm sure that there will be people that say that this is a very simplistic game. And again, I think it's easy to learn and easy to play, but figuring out a winning strategy with all the options available to you can make your head hurt. And it's something that I don't shy away from. I like it. I want to try it more. And I may even revisit this review in the future because I do want to play it more and figure out if this is a game that I may eventually love. But for now, for sure, if you are into sort of hand management, hand building, deck building games, this is one for you to give a shot. I think it is a very cool bridge between those two types of games. A heavy Euro thinky game and more sort of simplistic, faster deck building game. Definitely worth a shot, definitely worth a look. Lewis and Clark, The Expedition. My name is Nick, this has been Board Game Brawl, and I'm reminding you to get out there and game every day in every way. Take care.